The movie opens with a dramatic shot of the stormy skies looming over a remote island where thunder and lightning create a deafening spectacle. The scene then transitions to a teenager's bedroom where one of the boys, George, is concentrating on repairing a radio. Despite his efforts, he only manages to catch a brief moment of frequency. After watching him tinker with the radio for a while, his friends become bored and head out. Giving up, the boy follows his friends. The three friends then head to the nearby cinema, where a classic black and white horror film is playing. As they watch the movie, George becomes fixated on a man with Down syndrome sitting across from him, quickly averting his gaze when their eyes meet. After the movie ends, George gestures toward the man he had been fixated on, drawing his friend's attention to him, which leads to some light-hearted teasing. The next day, the boys venture to a nearby quarry and discover a snake concealed beneath a large stone. With careful precision, one of the boys, Luke, manages to immobilize the snake with an electric shock and playfully tosses it at George, who quickly sidesteps the unexpected prank. Amid laughter and camaraderie, the young boys carry on with their playful antics. After returning home that night, George, consumed by his obsession with the radio, spends hours sitting on his bed, tirelessly adjusting its small buttons in a quest to find a signal. The next day, he meets his friend near the lake, and as they gaze at the distant island, his friend Jacob mentions a monster that his sister claims inhabits the island. Jacob elaborates on the island's mysterious monster, painting a vivid picture of its immense size and fearsome claws that could cut down anything in its path. He emphasizes that the creature's terrifying presence has effectively stopped anyone from going to the island. When pressed for details about how the monster came to inhabit the island, Jacob reveals that his sister's account only mentioned that the creature emerged from underground and was responsible for the deaths of unfortunate individuals. When George questions why the monster hasn't been dealt with, their inquisitive friend Luke suggests that they take matters into their own hands and investigate the island firsthand. Playfully pushing George by insinuating that he's simply afraid, Jacob and Luke walk down the docking lane and leap into a waiting boat, urging George into action. After a brief moment of thought, George decides to join them, his curiosity and a hint of bravado overcoming any lingering fear. As they reach the quiet shores of the island, the boys spot a broken-down canoe, making them speculate about whether it was how the mysterious monster had arrived. In a mischievous move, they hand George the electric zapping stick and urge him to take the lead in exploring the area. George, unwilling to be the butt of their jokes, summons his courage and accepts the stick. As George ventures a few meters into the island, he comes across rocks tied to the trees, suspended mysteriously. Curious by the sight, he cautiously reaches out with his stick to investigate when the sudden roar of a boat engine jolts him back to reality. Hurrying his steps, he rushes back to the beach, only to discover his friends in the act of abandoning him, yelling to say hello to the monster. Frustrated, he returns to the beach and removes his shoes, hoping to dry them in the sun. As he explores the shoreline, George stumbles upon scattered remnants of a broken machine, sparking a glimmer of hope in his resourceful mind. Determined to establish a means of communication, he sets about piecing together the fragments, hoping to make some form of makeshift radio from the salvaged parts. While sitting there, he begins to hear frightening sounds coming from the woods and is startled, his distraction making him fall victim to a snake bite. After tending to his wound and fashioning a makeshift bandage from his socks to prevent infection, George sets out on a determined quest to seek help or any sign of civilization. As he searches the island, he detects a tripwire strung among the trees, causing the cans attached to it to jingle when disturbed. Intrigued, he experiments with the tripwire, only to be startled by the discovery of a massive claw mark formed into one of the trees. Walking closer, he places his hand against the imprint, the contrast in size serving as a chilling reminder of the giant creature that might have left its mark. Moving forward, George stumbles upon a makeshift shack with a frightening display of fish heads impaled on its door. Startled by the sight, George quickly runs away, his heart pounding with fear. As he rushes away from the place, the sky darkens and rain begins to pour. Seeking refuge from the heavy rain, George finds shelter within the hollowed bark of a fallen tree. As George awakens to the light of dawn, he is jolted by a searing pain in his hands. He removes his socks to discover his wound overrun with ants and oozing pus. Overcoming his shock, he slowly cleans the wound with his hands. Suddenly, the distant sounds of movement draw his attention, urging him to cautiously make his way back to the shack he had seen the night before. To his surprise, he finds a fire blazing in a barrel nearby. After ensuring the shack is empty, he resolves to take matters into his own hands, using his pocket knife to carefully cauterize the infected area of his hand. He is startled by another sound coming from the opposite direction of the woods. His heart races as he catches sight of a concealed figure, sending a surge of fear coursing through him. George attempts to flee, only to be stopped by a cunningly laid trap. After freeing himself, he lies flat on the ground, his senses heightened as he listens to the ominous footsteps passing by. After waiting for what seemed like an eternity, George cautiously rises and quickly retreats to the hollowed tree where he had slept the previous night. As he cowers within, his eyes widen in disbelief as he sees a looming figure that resembles a robot. Overwhelmed by fear and desperation, George grabs his infected arm and runs back to the shore, only to be greeted by the sight of the boat departing into the distance. Frantically screaming for them to return, George falls into the water, unable to stand any longer. When he wakes up, George finds himself in a hospital bed, his arm amputated since the infection had spread too far to stop. His mother comes to pick him up and holds him in a tight embrace. After returning home, George becomes secluded, unwilling to meet up with his friends who would come to visit him. One night, while having dinner, George's father approaches him and asks if he has seen anything while he was out on the island. When George confirms that he has, his father reminds him that he should have never gone out there. But now that he has, he warns him never to tell anyone about what he had seen and makes him promise. A couple of weeks later, George gets fitted for a cybernetic arm, which he can easily control. Returning to school, George begins to attend classes like he used to. One day in class, a girl sitting next to him passes him a note asking if he is a robot. Feeling embarrassed, George ignores the note and goes back to his studies. That night, while lying in bed, he hears the frightening screeching he had heard on the island and sits up on his bed. Looking at the arm he had placed on the stand for a few seconds, he tucks himself back into the sheets and goes to sleep. Years later, George awakens beside his wife Loretta and rises from bed to fix his robotic arm. Going to the kitchen, he prepares tea as Loretta joins him, commenting that he is talking in his sleep again. When he asks what he has been saying, she reveals that he seemed distressed about something. George sets his mug in the sink and notices that his robotic arm is malfunctioning. As he investigates the issue, he suddenly sees sparks coming from their room and quickly heads up the stairs. Upon reaching the source of the disturbance, he discovers his son Cole playing with the electric stick that George had once taken to the island. Warning his son never to touch it again because it is dangerous, he hides the electric stick in the top part of his closet. Bothered by the constant glitches, George goes to get his robotic arm seen. While getting it fixed, the technician tells him that there are newer models he could use, but George refuses, feeling attached to the object he had had for years. After his appointment, George goes to the barber shop to get a haircut. While on his chair, a young child begins to touch his arm, curious about what it is. Smiling, George moves his hand around to show the little girl that there is nothing to be frightened of. Later that evening, as George stands at the sink brushing his teeth alongside his wife, he confides that he never told the full extent of what occurred during his time on the island to his friends. Expressing his anxiety about revealing the truth, George admits his fear of speaking up. In response, Loretta reassures him that he doesn't need to make a fuss about it, mentioning that it was only a snake bite. While Loretta is fast asleep next to him, George is unable to close his eyes. Getting up from bed, George begins to tinker with his old radio and is startled when it transmits the screeching sound he had once heard on the island. The next day, George makes his way to the dock by the lake and gazes curiously at the distant island. Afterward, he visits his childhood home to see his aging mother. He asks whether his late father had ever shared anything about the island, noting that they never discussed such matters. George's mother explains that the entity he had encountered on the island held a deeply sentimental value to his father, similar to a beloved child, sadly acknowledging society's reluctance to embrace it. She tells him that, in its own unique manner, the entity possessed a form of life, creating a sense of compassion within her when George expresses concern about its continued existence. Frustrated by his mother's apparent lack of empathy regarding his experience on the island, George confronts her, demanding to know why his father hadn't simply destroyed the creation he had built. With a sorrowful expression, George's mother confides in him, revealing that his father couldn't bring himself to destroy the robot because it held a special significance as his very first creation. Despite fighting with the guilt, George's father made the difficult decision to transport the robot to the island and leave it there. Understanding that society would struggle to accept something so different, he believed the island to be the safest haven for his extraordinary creation. That night, George sets out in a boat for the island, determined to locate his father's creation. Recalling the path to the small shack, he discovers the robot constructing a fire nearby. As the machine catches sight of George, it emits a piercing screech, causing him to jump in surprise. Regaining his composure, George addresses the robot, asking if it recognizes him and reminding it that his father was the one who brought it to life. George expressed remorse for causing it harm during their initial encounter, casting aside the electrical stick as a gesture of goodwill. He then proceeded to detach his own robotic arm and carefully placed it on the ground, symbolizing his desire for peace and reconciliation. This act was a clear display of intention to make amends and forge a new understanding with the robot.